The name came out of nowhere, ripped from the throat of a dying man, and it stopped Roy Ford cold in the middle of the street. Florence Quinn had not meant to say it. She had not even known she was going to say it until the syllables were already hanging in the hot, dust-choked air between them, two words that landed on Roy Ford like a rifle shot to the chest. She watched the color drain from beneath his sun-darkened skin, watched his jaw go tight as a steel trap, watched something ancient and terrible move behind his eyes like a storm rolling in off the plains. "Where did you hear that name?" he said. His voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the kind of quiet that made the hairs on the back of Florence's neck stand up straight. "The man who attacked the stage," she said, keeping her voice steady because she was Florence Quinn and she had come too far and survived too much to fall apart now. "He said it before he died. He said to tell Roy Ford that Caleb Merritt remembers." Something shattered behind Roy Ford's eyes and then was locked away so fast she almost missed it. Almost. "I have not spoken that name aloud in years," he said, and she did not ask him to explain it. Not yet. Not there, standing in the middle of the main street of Redemption, Texas, in the savage June heat of 1882, with half the town watching from under their hat brims, and the body of the man who had attacked the stagecoach still cooling in the undertaker's wagon. She did not ask him to explain it because she understood, in the way that people who carry their own hidden burdens understand each other without needing a map, that some things could not be pulled out into the daylight without first being approached with great care. But she would ask him eventually. She would need to. Because whatever Caleb Merritt was, whatever dark past Roy Ford had buried so deeply that speaking a name could turn him to stone, it had followed him here to Redemption. And she was standing directly in the middle of its path. Florence Quinn had arrived in Redemption, Texas 11 days earlier, on a Thursday morning that smelled of cattle dust and gun oil and something else she could not name, something like ambition poorly disguised as desperation. She had come from St. Louis on a train as far as the rails would carry her, then by stagecoach for 3 days across country that grew more savage and more beautiful the further west it stretched, until she arrived at last in a town whose name she had found in a small advertisement placed in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Schoolteacher sought. Redemption, Texas. Single woman of good character and sound education preferred. Room and board provided. Salary negotiable. Apply in writing to Mayor Holt, Redemption, Texas. She had applied. She had been accepted. And she had come because she had no good reason to stay in St. Louis anymore, and approximately 800 reasons, some of them financial and some of them deeply personal, to go somewhere new. Florence was 26 years old, which was not young by the standards of 1882, particularly for a woman who was not yet married and had no immediate prospects of becoming so. She was not the sort of woman who inspired immediate, breathless attention in a room. She was slender and dark-haired, with gray eyes that noticed everything and gave away very little, and a quality of stillness about her that some people found restful and others found unnerving. She had been educated at a women's college in Cincinnati before circumstances reduced her family's fortune to rubble, and she had spent the last 3 years teaching at a private school in St. Louis, which had paid her just enough to survive and not quite enough to do anything else. She had left behind in St. Louis a life that had grown too small for her, a set of rooms that smelled of mildew, a position at a school whose headmaster had made certain very unwelcome advances, and a ghost. Not a real ghost, of course. Florence Quinn was too practical for that. But her younger brother Thomas had died of fever 2 winters past, and she could not walk past the boarding house where he had rented his room without feeling the weight of his absence so heavily that it pressed the breath from her lungs. So she had gone west, because west was the direction people went when they needed the world to be different. Redemption was not what she had imagined. It was bigger than she expected and smaller than she hoped. A main street of beaten earth and warped boardwalks flanked by false-fronted buildings that aspired to permanence and mostly achieved the appearance of stubbornness. There was a general store, a hotel, a livery stable, a barbershop, a church that needed painting, a saloon called the Silver Nail that was the most solidly built structure on the entire street, and a small school at the eastern edge of town that smelled of chalk and cedar, and the particular hope that children deposit in spaces where they are expected to learn things. Mayor Holt was a round, red-faced man with excellent intentions and organizational capacities that fell somewhat short of them. He showed Florence to her room above the general store, explained that the school had been without a teacher for 6 months since the previous one, a Mr. Ashby, had taken sudden leave of redemption under circumstances the mayor described as personal, and which Florence privately suspected were related to the Silver Nail, and told her that school would resume on Monday. She met most of the town in her first 3 days because redemption was small enough that newcomers were an event. She met Clara Briggs, who ran the general store with her husband, and who became Florence's first friend in redemption with the speed and thoroughness of a woman who had been starved for female companionship of her own intellectual caliber. She met the Reverend Packard, who was kind and a little vague, like a man whose thoughts were permanently arranged around something larger than the immediate present. She met the children who would be her students, 11 of them ranging from age 6 to 15, serious-faced and curious, some of them nervous, some of them openly calculating how much they could get away with. She did not meet Roy Ford in those first 3 days. She heard about him before she saw him. "He runs the sheriff's department," Clara told her on the second evening, the two of them sitting on the wooden chairs outside the general store in the hour after supper when the heat had fractionally relented. Though department is a generous word for it, he has one deputy, a boy named Pete, who means well and is terrified of him. He has been sheriff here for 4 years. He came from somewhere east of here, no one knows exactly where, and he does not talk about it. "Is he a good sheriff?" Florence asked. Clara considered this with the particular seriousness she brought to all questions. "He is an effective one. There was a great deal of trouble in this town before he came. There were men who came through from the old outlaw trails and treated redemption like their personal treasury. He put a stop to that quickly and firmly, and in a way that made very clear he was not interested in negotiation. Since then people largely behave, and the rest of the time he keeps very much to himself. He has a house on the north edge of town. He has a horse named Dusk that he takes care of with a devotion that is frankly touching. He reads. He is occasionally civil and never warm. He is perhaps 32 or 33 years old, and he has the eyes of a man who has seen things he wishes he had not." Florence said nothing more about it that evening, but she stored the description carefully in the back of her mind, the way she stored all information that seemed potentially useful or interesting. She met him 4 days after her arrival, which was a Sunday, on the steps of the church after Reverend Packard's service. She was talking to Clara and watching the congregation disperse when she became aware of a figure standing at the edge of the churchyard, not quite in and not quite out, as though he had not decided yet whether attending services placed him in some form of obligation he was not prepared to meet. He was tall, wide through the shoulders in the way that spoke of work rather than vanity, with dark hair that had been roughly cut, and a jaw that had not been shaved in 2 or 3 days. He wore the star on his chest with the ease of a man who has carried symbols long enough that they feel like part of his body rather than adornments. His eyes, when they moved to her and he realized she was looking back, were a very dark brown, the color of creek water in shadow, and they held exactly the quality Clara had described. Not hardness, precisely. Something more complicated than that. The look of a man who has made his peace with what he carries but has not made peace with how heavy it is. He nodded to her, a single, precise nod that was clearly meant as an acknowledgement and just as clearly not meant as an invitation to further conversation. Florence, who had been raised to have excellent manners and who found rules of politeness genuinely useful as social architecture, nodded back with equal precision and turned back to Clara. "That is Roy Ford," Clara said, very quietly because Clara missed almost nothing. I assumed, Florence said. She did not think about him obsessively afterward. She was too busy. The school opened on Monday and consumed her entirely in the best possible way. Because there is nothing in the world like 11 children who are hungry to learn to focus a person's attention. She threw herself into the work with the particular energy of someone who has been waiting for the right purpose to reveal itself, organizing her students by ability rather than age, setting ambitious reading assignments, introducing mathematics through practical problems involving measurement and commerce that she noticed went over rather better than the abstract kind. But Redemption was a small town, and she could not avoid Roy Ford entirely even if she had wanted to, which she was not entirely sure she did. She saw him most mornings, making his rounds along the main street, unhurried and watchful. She saw him at the general store occasionally, buying supplies with the economy of a man who had reduced his needs to essentials through long practice. Once she passed him on the boardwalk, and he stepped aside to let her pass, and said good morning with a courtesy that suggested he had been very carefully taught it at some point, and had decided to keep the lesson even if the circumstances that prompted it were gone. She said good morning back. She kept walking. She felt his eyes on her back for a moment, and then they were not, and she did not look around. The attack on the stagecoach happened on her 11th day in Redemption. She had volunteered, partly out of practical necessity, and partly out of the restless curiosity that had always been her chief personality characteristic, to ride the stage to the nearest town, a settlement called Harker that was 30 miles northeast, to collect certain school supplies that Mayor Holt had ordered, and that could not wait for the next supply delivery. Clara had offered the loan of her second horse, but Florence had not yet had occasion to ride out here, and the stage seemed sensible. It was not sensible. It was, it turned out, very much the wrong choice on a very particular day. The men came out of the dry creek bed 3 miles south of Harker, 4 of them on horses, riding hard. Florence had heard enough about stagecoach robberies to know what was happening before the driver had finished shouting. She flattened herself on the seat and did not scream, which she considered a personal achievement, and stayed very still while the coach rattled and lurched, and the shooting happened outside in ways she could not entirely track. There was a man inside the coach with her, a traveling merchant from Abilene named Pharaoh, who also did not scream but who was sweating through his shirt collar and repeating the Lord's Prayer at rapid pace under his breath, which Florence found oddly comforting in its sincerity. The coach stopped. The door was wrenched open. One of the men, young, with pale eyes and a scar through one eyebrow, put a gun in her face and told her to hand over anything of value. She gave him the small amount of cash she had brought and the watch that had been her father's, and she looked directly at him while she did it because Florence Quinn had found that looking directly at people who frightened her was the only way to convince herself that they did not have as much power over her as they seemed to. What she did not give him was the letter she had tucked inside the bodice of her dress, which was from a lawyer in St. Louis regarding certain arrangements concerning her brother Thomas's small estate, and which was no business of anyone else's. Then Roy Ford came. She heard him before she saw him, or rather she heard the results of his arrival, a sudden change in the quality of the chaos outside, a different urgency in the shouting. She risked a look out the window and saw him on the gray horse Clara had called Dusk, moving with a controlled and absolute authority that was unlike anything she had seen in a human being on horseback. He was shouting in a voice that carried no panic whatsoever, and 3 of the 4 men scattered before he had even drawn. The 4th did not scatter. The 4th, it turned out, had been shot already, off his horse and lying in the thin scrub grass a few yards from the stagecoach. Florence climbed out because she needed to see what was happening, and because sitting in the coach waiting was the kind of passivity she had never been able to sustain under pressure, and she knelt by the shot man because he was conscious and clearly had something urgent he needed to say. "Tell Ford," he said, and his voice was wet and rasping, and she leaned closer because the words were sliding out on a tide of effort. "Tell Roy Ford. Caleb Merritt remembers. Tell him Caleb Merritt is coming." And then he died, right there in the scrub grass with Florence's hand near his shoulder, and the sun beating down on both of them with complete indifference. She stood up. Roy Ford had dismounted and was coming toward her. His deputy Pete, who had apparently ridden out with him from somewhere, was checking on the driver. The merchant Pharaoh was standing by the coach, shaking in a way that was perfectly understandable, and which Florence made a mental note to be kind about. She told Roy Ford what the man had said. She watched the name Caleb Merritt land on him like a physical blow he had been years expecting and years dreading. And he said those words, flat and quiet and final. "I have not spoken that name aloud in years." And she did not ask him to explain it. That evening, after the bodies had been attended to and Pharaoh had been given a stiff drink at the Silver Nail, and the sheriff's report had been filed, and the town had processed the attack with the particular combination of alarm and excitement that violent events produced in small communities, Florence sat in the school after sunset with a lantern burning and thought about what she had learned and what she had not, and what the two things together might mean. She was not, she told herself firmly, frightened. She had been frightened during the robbery and had managed it and was past it. What she felt now was something more complicated and considerably more interesting than fear, which was the beginning of the realization that the town of Redemption, Texas, was not going to be the quiet new start she had imagined when she came west. Something was happening here, something with deep roots and hidden teeth, and she was standing in the middle of it with no map and no compass except the one she carried inside herself, which had always pointed toward the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient. She went to bed and slept soundly, which was something she had always been able to do in circumstances that would have kept other people awake, and in the morning she taught school. Roy Ford came to the school 3 days later. He did not come during lessons. He waited until the afternoon when the children had gone home, appearing in the doorway with his hat in his hands in a way that suggested he had thought carefully about the gesture and decided it was appropriate. Florence was erasing the blackboard. She turned when she heard him and waited. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. He came in and sat in one of the chairs, which were sized for children, and therefore made him look slightly ridiculous, and she thought she saw the ghost of something self-aware about his expression that might, in a different man, have been humor. She sat across from him at her desk and folded her hands and gave him her attention. "The man who died," Roy Ford said. "The one who gave you the message. His name was Dix. He worked for a man named Caleb Merritt, who is a criminal, a serious one. He runs an operation out of the New Mexico territory that involves cattle, stolen goods, money that has come from places it shouldn't, and the kind of violence that does not ask anyone's permission before it visits." "And Caleb Merritt has a reason to send you a message," Florence said. "He has a reason," Roy Ford confirmed. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was deciding what to say and what to keep. "He and I have a history. From before I was here, it is old business that I believed was finished." "It does not appear to be finished," Florence said gently. "No. Is he coming here, to Redemption?" Roy Ford's jaw tightened. "That is what I believe. Based on the message and based on what I know about how Caleb Merritt operates, he is not a man who sends messages to let you know he is thinking about you. He sends messages to let you know he is coming and to give you the particular pleasure of knowing it in advance." "That is a very specific kind of cruelty," Florence said. Something moved in his eyes. "Yes, it is. And I am telling you this because you were the one who brought me that message, and because I think it is only right that you know what it means, and because—" He paused, and she noticed that the pause cost him something. "Because I would not want you to be in danger you didn't know was there. If you want to leave Redemption until this is resolved, I would understand it completely. I would tell Mayor Holt that the town needs to find another arrangement, and that your departure is not a reflection of your character." Florence looked at him for a long time. He looked back. He did not flinch from her gaze, which she respected. "I am not leaving," she said. "Miss Quinn." "I am not leaving," she said again, very calmly. "I am a school teacher. I have 11 students who have had an interrupted education and who need consistency. I'm not going to abandon them because of a threat that may or may not materialize in a specific way." "It will materialize," he said, with the certainty of a man who knows his adversary. "Then we will deal with it when it does," she said. "Together, presumably, since you are the sheriff and that is your function." He stared at her for a long moment. He seemed to be recalibrating something. "You are not what I expected," he said at last. "What did you expect? Someone more frightened?" "I am plenty frightened," Florence said. "I am just better than average at not showing it. My mother considered visible fear a form of bad manners." The ghost of something crossed his face again, and this time she was more sure it was humor, or the shape of where humor used to live before something had replaced it. "Your mother sounds like a formidable woman." "She was," Florence said. "She died 4 years ago, and I still feel her watching me from somewhere, judging my posture." He stood, replacing his hat with the same deliberateness with which he had removed it. "I will be keeping a close watch on the town," he said, "and I will make sure you have the means to alert me quickly if something concerns you." "Thank you," she said. He paused in the doorway. Something hesitated in him, and she watched it, this man who kept everything behind glass, turning over whatever he was deciding whether to say. "Miss Quinn, I am sorry you were caught up in this, in my history." "Your history is not your fault," she said. "Or if it is, that is something for you to sort out, not me." He left. Florence sat alone in the afternoon light of the schoolhouse, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the particular heightened aliveness that comes from being in close proximity to someone whose interiority is a mystery worth solving. She was irritated at herself for it, but not very. The days that followed had a rhythm that was deceptively ordinary. She taught school. She ate supper with Clara most evenings. She read in her room at night by oil lamp. She wrote letters to the lawyer in St. Louis about Thomas's estate, which was not large but required documentation. But underneath the ordinary rhythm was something that was not ordinary at all, a current of tension that ran through the whole town like a wire pulled tight. Roy Ford increased his visibility on the streets. Pete, the deputy, who was perhaps 20, and had the look of someone who had chosen law enforcement because he admired the principle of it and was still working on the practice, began making regular checks of the outlying roads. The men at the Silver Nail spoke in lower voices than usual, and she and Roy Ford developed a habit of conversation. It began practically, with his occasional stops at the school to update her on the situation, as he had promised. But the updates were brief, and the conversations that followed them were not, and Florence noticed over the course of a week, and then too that they had settled into a pattern of talking that was almost entirely not about Caleb Merritt, and was instead about everything else. He had read widely, which surprised her, and then surprised her that it had surprised her, because there was no reason a man could not be a sheriff and a reader simultaneously. He had opinions about the novels of Charles Dickens that were strong enough to carry an argument. He knew the names of birds in a way that suggested he had learned them from someone who loved them, and she did not press on that because she could feel that it was near something tender. She talked to him about Thomas, one evening in late June when the heat had finally consented to break, and there was almost a coolness in the air, the two of them sitting on the steps of the school because neither of them had quite decided to leave. She had not talked about Thomas to many people, had learned that grief was something most people either wanted to fix or avoid, and Roy Ford did neither. He just listened, with the quality of attention that was his most striking characteristic, the sense that he was genuinely present in the specific moment being shared with him rather than composing his response while she spoke. "He was funny," she said. "That is what I miss most. He had a way of finding the exact right absurd angle on any situation. Nothing was ever quite as grave as it looked, according to Thomas." She paused. "I find myself trying to locate that angle myself now when things are difficult. It is not the same, but it is something." What was the absurd angle on coming to redemption? He asked. That I answered an advertisement in a newspaper, she said. That I packed my life into 2 trunks and boarded a train and then a stagecoach and arrived in a town whose entire aspiration is contained in its name, and that my first substantial experience of it was being robbed at gunpoint. Thomas would have found that very funny. He would have said I was living in a dime novel without the authorial guarantee of a happy ending. Are dime novels guaranteed happy endings? Thomas always said they were. He was an optimist. Roy Ford was quiet for a moment. The evening light was doing something golden and elaborate with the dust in the air. My sister read every dime novel she could get her hands on, he said, and his voice had a quality she had not heard in it before, something soft and somewhat careful, as though he was testing the water temperature with his foot before committing to the step. She said the woman always survived because the author wouldn't dare. Florence turned to look at him. She watched him realize he had said more than he intended and wait for her to press on it, and she saw the slight adjustment in him when she did not, when she simply let it rest where he had placed it. Your sister has good literary analysis instincts, Florence said. He almost smiled. She was certain of it that time. She was sharp as a tack, he said. About most things. The past tense sat between them. Florence did not pursue it, but the pieces were assembling themselves in her mind whether she asked for them or not. The man who would not speak a name, the dark past he carried with the practiced ease of long habit, the sister who read dime novels and the sharp edges of grief in the tense he used for her, the criminal with a message and a reason that stretched back through years of buried history. She was beginning to understand, without being told, the shape of what had happened to Roy Ford. She was not sure she was right. She knew better than to mistake intuition for fact. But the outline was there, in the spaces between what he said and what he kept. It was Clara who filled in some of the rest, not because she gossiped exactly, but because Clara was the kind of woman whose knowledge of her community was a form of stewardship, and she shared it as such. I had a letter from my cousin in Laredo, Clara said one afternoon, very carefully not looking at Florence, which was a technique Florence had noticed she used when delivering information she considered delicate. She mentioned that there was talk in certain circles about Caleb Merritt, that he had been involved some years ago in a scheme that went badly, involving someone who was supposed to be his partner. That the partner had turned evidence and it had destroyed something Merritt had built over years. And the partner, Florence asked, equally careful, got away, Clara said, changed his name, started over, somewhere west, it was said. Florence said nothing. Clara looked out the window. It is only talk, Clara said. My cousin collects talk the way some people collect spoons. It may not be worth anything. It may be worth quite a lot, Florence said. The next time Roy Ford stopped by the school, Florence studied him with new attention. She was looking for the seams, the places where the man he was now had been stitched over the man he had been before. She found them, she thought, in small things. The way he sometimes checked his own instincts twice before acting, as though he had once trusted instincts that proved wrong and was not prepared to repeat the error. The way he was scrupulously, almost excessively honest in everything she had ever observed him doing, as though he had made a private covenant with himself on the subject. The way he watched redemption with a protectiveness that was larger than professional duty, as if the town and its people were something he had been given on trust and was determined not to lose. It came to a head on a Thursday in early July. He came to the school not in the afternoon this time, but at noon, while the children were eating their lunches in the yard, and his face had a controlled urgency to it that she recognized immediately as someone who has received news they hope not to receive. He is close, Roy Ford said. I got word this morning. He is in a town called Prairie Fork, which is 16 miles south. He has 6 men with him. Florence absorbed this. What is your plan? I have sent to the county seat for additional deputies. They will not arrive for 2 days. I am asking the town to be on alert and stay off the roads after dark. He paused. I want you to move to the hotel temporarily. Your room above the general store is exposed. All right, she said, without argument, because she was not foolish and the hotel had a sturdier door. There is something else, he said. He looked out the window at the children playing in the yard, looked back at her, and she felt the shift in him, something moving in a direction neither of them had formally acknowledged it was moving. I want you to know that whatever happens, whatever comes out about who I am and where I came from, what you have observed in me here is true. This town is real to me. These people are real to me. I would die before I let harm come to them. I know that, she said. You may learn things about my past that give you a different opinion. Possibly, she said, but I would rather hear them from you. He looked at her for a long time. Outside, one of the children shrieked with laughter at something, and the ordinary domestic joy of it was oddly piercing in the context of the moment. My name before I came here, he said slowly, was Roy Canfield, not Roy Ford. I changed it 4 years ago when I came to Redemption. He stopped. This was clearly costing him something. She waited with all the patience she possessed. I was involved with a man named Caleb Merritt in the New Mexico territory, in a partnership I am not proud of. I was young and I was stupid, and I believed that the rules applied to other people and that I was smart enough to operate outside them without consequence. I was wrong. About all of it. He paused again. When I finally understood what Merritt was doing, what I was part of, I went to the federal authorities. I gave them everything I had. It broke the operation apart, and Merritt went to prison for 3 years, which was less than he deserved and less than I expected. And your sister? Florence said very gently. His face changed. The controlled surface fractured in a small but visible way, like ice under unexpected weight. She was living in the territory with her husband. After I gave evidence before I could get to her, Merritt's remaining men, he stopped. Rebuilt himself from the inside out in the span of 3 seconds, which Florence watched with an ache in her chest that was not comfortable. She died. Her husband survived, and he moved east with their daughter. I have not seen them since. It was safer for them if I was dead, and I have been dead to them, as Roy Canfield. Here I am Roy Ford, and I have tried every day to be someone who deserves the second chance that cost my sister her life. The silence that followed was full and heavy and necessary. Florence did not fill it with condolences or reassurances. She let it be what it was, which was the truth of him, laid out on a schoolroom desk between them like something that had been locked in a box for years and needed air. "Thank you for telling me," she said at last. "I needed you to know," he said. "Before whatever happens next, I needed you to know who you were dealing with." "I know who I am dealing with," Florence said quietly. "I have known for some time. The question is whether you know who you are dealing with." He looked at her, and something in his expression shifted from guarded to something else, something that was precarious and real and alive in a way that the careful distance he usually maintained was not. "Tell me," he said. "I'm not frightened of your past," she said. "I'm not frightened of Caleb Merritt. I'm not leaving this town, and I'm not leaving the people in it, including you." She paused. "Especially you." The words sat between them with all their implication fully visible. She watched him take them in, watched something long sealed in him respond to them the way a room responds to the first window opened after a long winter. He reached across the desk, slowly enough that she could see it coming, and took her hand. Not in an extravagant way, not dramatically, just his hand over hers, warm and certain. "Florence," he said, and her name in his voice was different from how any name of hers had ever been said before, as though he had considered all the syllables of it and decided each one was worth keeping. "Roy," she said back, and the simplicity of it felt enormous. The sound of the children coming back in from the yard broke the moment cleanly, and he released her hand and stood, and the controlled surface came back over him, but not quite as completely as before. There was a gap in it now that had not been there previously, and she could see through it to the man underneath. "I will have Pete escort you to the hotel this afternoon," he said. "I will be fine on my own," she said. "I know you will," he said. "I would prefer to have someone with you anyway." She let him have it. That night in her room at the hotel, Florence lay awake and thought about Roy Ford's face when he had said his sister's name without saying it, when the grief had fractured through the control for just that one instant. She thought about what it meant to carry that for 4 years, to rebuild yourself out of guilt and resolve, and the fierce protective love of a town that didn't know who you were. She thought about the way his hand had felt over hers. She thought about Thomas and what he would have said, and she could almost hear him. Florence Quinn has gone and fallen in love in a dime novel after all. She almost laughed. Then she almost cried. Then she went to sleep. Caleb Merritt arrived in Redemption the following Saturday afternoon. He came openly, which Florence had not expected, riding into town on a black horse with his 6 men arrayed behind him in a formation that was a statement of intent as much as anything else. She saw them from the window of the hotel and felt her stomach tighten, but kept very still and did not run. There was no reason to run yet. Caleb Merritt was perhaps 40, lean in the way of a man whose energy is never quite contained in his body, with a quality of coiled attention that she recognized instinctively as dangerous. He wore a good hat and a good coat, and the guns at his hip were clean and well tended in the way that serious men kept serious tools. Roy Ford met him in the middle of the street. Florence positioned herself at the window and watched what she could not help watching, the 2 men facing each other in the afternoon light, the history between them visible in the way they held themselves, in the distance they maintained, in the readiness in every line of Roy Ford's body. She could not hear what was said between them from where she stood, but she watched, and after perhaps 3 minutes of conversation that looked more like negotiation between opposing forces than anything social, Roy Ford gestured toward the sheriff's office and Merritt, after a pause that was clearly meant to establish that he was choosing to comply rather than being directed, dismounted and followed. 2 of the men with Merritt stayed on their horses and did not move. Ford dismounted and spread out along the street in a way that was not subtle. Pete, whom Florence could see from her window, was positioned near the general store with his hand near his gun and his face showing every ounce of the effort he was expending to look calm. Florence came down from her room. Clara, who appeared from behind the general store counter with the expression of a woman who knows that staying inside is the sensible choice and has decided to reject it, fell into step beside her immediately. "What are you doing?" Clara said. "Walking," Florence said. "Where?" "That direction." She indicated the sheriff's office with a motion of her chin. "Florence, I know," Florence said. "I know. Come with me if you want to," Clara, to her credit, came. They did not go inside the sheriff's office. Florence was not quite prepared to be that forward, and there were also 2 of Merritt's men in her path who were very large and very watchful. But she positioned herself on the boardwalk outside within earshot of the window, which had been left open in deference to the July heat, and she listened. And Clara stood beside her, and listened too, because Florence had not lived 37 years without choosing her friends on the basis of compatible instincts. What she heard through that window rearranged some of what she understood and confirmed the rest of it. Merritt's voice was educated and even and had a quality of cold patience that was its own form of threat. Roy Ford's voice, which she knew in all its registers by now, was equally even and considerably warmer, which paradoxically made it more rather than less dangerous sounding. "You cannot be here officially, Caleb," Roy Ford said. "You know that. The terms of your release prohibit this kind of direct contact." "The terms of my release were written by men who understood the letter of the law very well and its spirit not at all," Merritt said. "I am not here officially, Roy. I am here as a private citizen in a free country exercising the constitutional right to travel. With 6 armed men." "A man has to be careful," Merritt said, and the pleasantness in his voice was the most disturbing thing about it. "You, of all people, should understand the value of security." "What do you want?" A pause. Florence pressed closer to the wall, aware that this was not behavior her mother would have approved of and genuinely not caring. "What I want," Merritt said, "is what was taken from me. 3 years of my life, Roy. 3 years in a federal facility. My operation, my network, my resources, all of it destroyed by someone I trusted. I want that debt acknowledged. And then And then we can discuss what form acknowledgement takes. You know I can't give you money, Roy Ford said. I don't have it. I gave everything to the authorities and I have been a county sheriff for 4 years on a salary that barely covers my supplies. I'm not necessarily talking about money, Merritt said. What I am talking about is a choice. You can walk out of this town and leave it, and I will be satisfied with that. Your humiliation and your absence as a form of repayment. Or you can stay, and I will make staying very uncomfortable for everyone involved. Another pause. Including a certain schoolteacher who seems to have caught your attention. Florence's blood went cold, then hot. Then settled into something that was not fear but was very close to it, the clear-eyed recognition of a specific danger with her name on it. Roy Ford's voice through the window had gone very quiet. You will leave her out of this. That depends entirely on you, Merritt said. There was a silence that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. Give me tonight, Roy Ford said. I need to think. You have until morning, Merritt said. We will be camped south of town. I hope you make the right choice, Roy, for everyone's sake. Florence moved away from the window before she heard anything else. She and Clara walked quickly back to the general store and went inside, and Clara locked the door and they both stood in the dim interior catching their breath. He is going to leave, Florence said. Possibly, Clara said. He thinks it will protect the town, Florence said. He thinks it will protect me. That is very likely, Clara said. He is wrong, Florence said. Clara looked at her. What do you mean? I mean that Caleb Merritt is not a man who is satisfied with one thing, Florence said, and she was thinking quickly, arranging the pieces of what she knew with the particular methodical clarity that came to her under pressure. He asked Roy to leave as a humiliation. But leaving would also mean that Roy Ford is back to being a man without a town, without a name, without the legitimacy that a sheriff's star provides. And Caleb Merritt would know where he went, because Merritt does not want Roy gone. He wants Roy ruined, and he wants him visible so that the ruination is public. Clara was quiet for a moment. And the town? If Roy leaves, the town loses its protections, and Merritt has demonstrated that his reach extends wherever he chooses to extend it, Florence said. Leaving is not a solution. It is a surrender that purchases nothing. What are you going to do? Clara said. I am going to talk to Roy Ford, Florence said. She went to the sheriff's office after Merritt and his men had left, which was a matter of perhaps 20 minutes. Roy Ford was behind his desk with a map spread in front of him and the look of a man conducting a very concentrated internal argument with himself. He looked up when she came in. His face, reading her expression, went from startled to resigned in the space of a breath. You were outside the window, he said. It was not a question. Yes, she said, sitting across from him. Florence, don't, she said. Don't tell me to leave. Don't tell me it is safer somewhere else. Don't make the choice of disappearing from this town because you think it protects me, because it does not. He looked at her for a long time. You heard everything. Yes. Then you understand what he is prepared to do. I understand what he has said he is prepared to do, Florence said. There is a difference. He wants leverage over you, and the best leverage he has is the threat, not the execution of it. If he actually hurt someone in this town, he would draw the kind of federal attention he cannot afford. He spent 3 years in prison and he is not going back. Roy Ford stared at her. You figured that out just now. I have been thinking about it since the message in the road, she said honestly. I did not have all the context until today. He is dangerous, Roy Ford said. I am not questioning your analysis, but you must not underestimate him. He has men who do not have the same calculations he does. I know, she said. Which is why you need the federal deputies who are already on their way, and which is why you need to keep Merritt in this town and talking until they arrive. He looked at her for a long moment that felt like it contained several smaller moments inside it. What you are proposing is that we do not run, she said. That we stay exactly where we are and we face this the right way, with law and with truth. You turned evidence once before because you understood that the truth was the only thing worth standing on. I'm asking you to do the same thing again. It cost me everything the first time, he said. Not everything, she said very quietly. You are still here." He looked away from her, out the window at the street where redemption went about its afternoon business in the slightly heightened key that spoke of collective awareness that something was happening. He looked at the town he had built himself into, the town that had no idea who it was housing but which he had protected as fiercely as if it were his own name. "I could lose this," he said. "When the truth about who I am comes out, I could lose this. The sheriff's position, the trust of the people here." "That is possible," Florence said honestly, because she would not lie to him. "Or you could find that the people here know you well enough by now to understand that a man is more than his worst chapter. It seems to me that redemption, Texas might be a town that understands the concept of second chances." He turned back to her. The quality of what was in his face had shifted again, moved past the careful and guarded into something raw and real that made her chest hurt in a way she had come to associate with things that mattered. "You are extraordinary," he said. "You know that." "I am practical," she said. "That is generally mistaken for something more interesting." "In your case," he said, "I am very sure it is both." They sat together that evening, the two of them and Clara and the Reverend Packard, and three of the more solid men of the town who Roy Ford trusted with the situation, in a room above the hotel, and they made a plan. Roy Ford sent a rider to the federal marshal's office to request urgent attendance rather than just additional deputies. He sent a message to Merritt's camp that was courteous and firm and bought them time. Pete rode the perimeter of town through the night with two volunteers Florence had not expected to be volunteers. Large, quiet ranchers named Alvarez and Drummond, who came forward with the particular matter-of-fact courage of men who have decided quietly what they are willing to do and are simply waiting for the moment to do it. And Florence, who could not sleep, sat up in the hotel room with a candle and wrote out everything she knew about Caleb Merritt's operation, everything she had heard through that window and everything Roy had told her, in careful, organized paragraphs that could be handed directly to a federal marshal with no translation required. The federal marshals arrived at midday on Sunday, which was faster than anyone had expected, which turned out to be because the marshal's office had already been watching Merritt since his release and had been tracking his movements toward redemption with an interest that Roy Ford had not known about but which worked very neatly in everyone's favor. What followed in the next 6 hours was not the confrontation Florence had imagined, which had involved more drama and possibly gunfire. It was, instead, a legal proceeding conducted in the open air of Redemption's Main Street, with a clarity and efficiency that she found deeply satisfying. The federal marshals, 3 of them, presented documentation of Merritt's violations of his release terms. They presented evidence of the attack on the stagecoach, which had been committed by men in Merritt's employ. They presented Florence's written account, which the lead marshal, a gray-haired woman-handling professional named Marshal Crane who had 40 years of experience, and the bearing of a man who has been argued with by better people than present company, read with visible approval. Caleb Merritt was arrested. His men, some of whom were more followers than true believers and recognized the moment when it shifted, gave up their weapons with considerably less resistance than they had projected. It was over with a quietness that felt almost anticlimactic after the days of tension preceding it. And then it was not over, because as Marshal Crane had predicted and Roy Ford had known, the question of who Roy Ford actually was had to be addressed. Roy Ford addressed it himself, which Florence thought was the bravest thing she watched him do in all of it, standing in the street with the marshal and several of the townspeople who had gathered, and telling the truth in his own words. Roy Canfield. His real name, the partnership he was not proud of, the evidence he had turned, the years he had spent in redemption trying to be the man he intended to be all along. The town listened. Florence watched it listen. She watched Clara's face, which moved through several emotions and settled on something that looked like thoughtful acceptance. She watched the Reverend Packard, who looked as though this confirmed some theological position he had privately held for some time. She watched the men who had stood guard through the night look at each other and look at Roy Ford. Mayor Holt, who was not perhaps the most decisive man in redemption but who had good instincts when it mattered, stepped forward. "You have been our sheriff for 4 years," he said. "I believe the record speaks." It was not a complete absolution, and it was not meant to be, but it was, in that moment, enough. Marshal Crane, for his part, had a document in his pocket that formalized Roy Ford's real identity in the context of his cooperation with federal authorities, effectively legitimizing the name change as part of his protected witness arrangement. He had not known this document existed. It turned out that the federal government was better at keeping track of people than Roy had given it credit for. He held the document and looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Florence, who was standing 20 feet away, and something crossed his face that was not quite a smile and not quite relief, but contained elements of both and a third thing she was not prepared to name yet in public. The weeks that followed were a recalibration, for redemption and for everyone in it. The town talked about what had happened in the thorough and somewhat exhausting way that small towns process events, working through every angle, every implication, every question of what it meant and what should be done about it. Roy Ford answered questions when they were asked directly and did not volunteer more than necessary, and Florence noticed that the responses he received were generally warmer than he had expected and considerably warmer than he had, perhaps, thought he deserved. Clara was warm. Reverend Packard preached a sermon that was technically about the biblical concept of redemption, the theological kind, but which several people told Florence afterward was clearly also about the other kind. Pete, the deputy, who had been shaken by the revelation for about 48 hours, arrived on the third morning with the determined look of someone who has made a decision and is going to stick with it, and told Roy Ford he still wanted to be a deputy if that was all right. Roy Ford told him it was all right, and Florence, who witnessed this exchange from the doorway of the school, felt something in her chest that was purely warm and uncomplicated. She and Roy Ford began their courtship in the way that felt natural to both of them, which was to say gradually, and without any of the formal declarations that made either of them uncomfortable. He walked her home from the school on Tuesdays and Thursdays, which became known among the children without anyone telling them, because children always know, and resulted in a certain amount of cheerful nudging among the older students that Florence addressed with dignity and a firm hand on the subject of minding one's own business. He brought her books. This was, she would tell Clara later, how she knew for certain. Not the walking and not the conversations, and not the way his eyes always found hers first when he entered a room, though all of those things were real and considerable. It was the books, because he brought her precisely the ones she would have chosen herself, which meant he had been paying attention in a way that was its own kind of courtship, quiet and thorough and completely him. He brought her a volume of Emerson's essays, which she had mentioned once in passing as something she had never managed to find in St. Louis. He brought her a natural history of Texas birds, in paper wrappers because the binding had come loose, that turned out to be the source of all his bird knowledge. Inscribed on the inside cover in handwriting she recognized was a woman's but did not ask about, because some things were his to share when he was ready. He brought her a novel by George Eliot that he had read himself, and which they argued about for 3 evenings with the completely unself-conscious engagement of two people who have forgotten to be careful with each other and find it a relief. She brought him things too. She made him a very good apple pie using Clara's oven and Clara's recipe, which Clara offered with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has decided she approves of a development and wants to support it. She copied out for him a letter her brother Thomas had written to her the Christmas before he died, which contained a story about a horse and a frozen river that she had not been able to tell anyone yet, but which felt somehow right to share with Roy. He read it twice slowly and looked up at her with an expression that required no translation. She told him about her life in St. Louis in more detail than she had told anyone, the father who had lost his money in a bad investment and whose pride had prevented him from admitting it until it was too late, the school in Cincinnati, where she had found for the first time that she was good at something that mattered, the years of careful economizing and the small dignities she had maintained, and the ones she had let go because not all dignities are worth the cost. He listened to all of it. He told her, a little at a time, about his own past, not just the Caleb Merritt part but the before that part, the childhood in Virginia, the father who was a schoolteacher himself, which made her smile in a way she suspected he found overwhelming, the move west in his early 20s fueled by the same restlessness that fueled a great many young men of that era, the wrong turn that had led him to Merritt's orbit, and the longer, harder right turn that had brought him out of it. He told her about his sister. Her name was Clara, which caused a small, complicated moment with the Clara who ran the general store that everyone eventually found slightly funny. Roy's Clara had been younger, 28 when she died, and she had been stubborn and funny, and the kind of woman who was beloved by everyone who knew her and who had kept Roy honest when his own judgment was failing. He talked about her with a grief that had been worn smooth by time but not diminished, and Florence listened and did not try to fix it. And afterward he reached across the supper table and took her hand again in that way he had, careful and certain, and they sat quietly with all of it for a while. By August, the town had settled into a new understanding of itself and its sheriff, and Roy Ford had settled into a new understanding of who he was in this particular present rather than the particular past, and Florence Quinn had settled into redemption, with the completeness of a person who has found the place that fits. The schoolchildren adored her. She adored them back, which she expressed through high standards and genuine attention, which children recognize as the most important form of love available from an authority figure. She had expanded the curriculum to include geography, because the world was large and they were going to live in it, and a practical science she called observation of the natural world, which mostly involved taking the children outside and having them look carefully at things and write down what they noticed, and which the parents of Redemption received with enthusiasm, because it sounded educational and resulted in their children being both entertained and tired. She wrote letters to Thomas's lawyer and settled his estate, which amounted to a small amount of money and a box of books, the books being worth considerably more to her. She had the box shipped to Redemption at a cost she considered entirely reasonable, and unpacked it in her room above the general store with the particular feeling of a person who is making a place into a home. She and Clara had Sunday dinner together every week, and Roy Ford joined them the third Sunday, and then every Sunday thereafter, which Clara managed with perfect tact, including him in the conversation without making it remarkable and making room for the quiet humor that was beginning to surface in him more regularly in the company of people he trusted. He asked her to marry him in September. It was not what she expected, which is to say it was not elaborate or staged for effect. They were walking back from the school on a Thursday evening, a clear evening with the sky going from orange to violet in the west with the theatrical enthusiasm that Texas skies brought to sunset, and he stopped walking and she stopped because he did, and he turned to her. "I am not good at this," he said. "At what?" she said. "At saying things I mean," he said. "I have spent a great deal of time not saying them. I am out of practice." "You have been practicing with me for months," she said. Something warm crossed his face. "You have made it easier," he said. "You are, I think, the only person who has made it easier. I would like to keep you nearby. In a permanent and formal capacity, if that is something you would consider." "You are proposing marriage," she said. "I am proposing marriage," he confirmed, with the careful dignity of a man who is doing something new and important, and is determined to do it right even if he is not certain of the exact form. Florence looked at him in the violet evening light, this man who had rebuilt himself out of guilt and determination and genuine goodness, who listened to everything she said with real attention, who brought her Emerson and argued about Eliot and knew the names of birds and carried his grief like a weight he had decided was worth keeping because it was real. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He exhaled, which she realized he had been holding since before the question, and then he smiled, fully and without reservation, in a way she had been waiting to see since that first ghost of it in the schoolroom, and it was worth every minute she had waited. He took her hand, and then his arms went around her in the first real embrace of what had been building between them, solid and warm, and without any of the careful distances he usually maintained. And she put her face against his shoulder and thought about Thomas, and how he would have said "I told you so" about the dime novel ending, and felt very glad to be exactly where she was. They were married in October, in the church that had finally been repainted because Florence had organized a painting party with the schoolchildren that had resulted in 3 children temporarily lavender, and a coat of white paint on the walls that the Reverend Packard said made the building feel like a new beginning. The ceremony was small by the standards of what Florence had once imagined a wedding might be, back when she was younger and had a complete family and life, had not yet done all the things it was going to do. It was large by the standards of who she was now, because Clara was her witness and Pete was Roy's witness, and the whole town came regardless because Redemption was the kind of town where a wedding was a communal event, whether or not invitations had been formally issued. She wore a dress that Clara had helped her alter, dove-gray silk that had been her mother's, which Florence had carried in one of those 2 trunks all the way from St. Louis because she had not been able to leave it and had not been entirely sure why. Now she understood why. She stood at the altar in her mother's dress and her father's watch, which the stagecoach robber had taken, and Roy Ford had quietly recovered from Merritt's men and returned to her without comment, and looked at Roy Ford standing across from her with Pete at his shoulder and the whole of Redemption behind him. He looked at her the way he looked at things he was paying real attention to, which was completely and without reservation, and she thought that this was perhaps the thing she loved most about him, that his attention, once fully given, was total. She said her vows clearly, because Florence Quinn had always been clear. He said his with a careful gravity that cracked open once, right at the end, when his voice did something that was not quite steady for one syllable, and she felt everyone in the room quietly absorb it with the particular tenderness that a community reserves for moments of real human vulnerability in someone they have learned to respect. After the ceremony, the town celebrated with the generosity it brought to all events, a long table in the street with every family contributing food, music from a fiddle and a harmonica played by the Alvarez brothers, dancing that began formally and became increasingly informal as the evening wore on. Florence danced with Roy Ford, who danced with the serious concentration of a man who is performing a skill he does not practice often and is determined to do correctly, and who improved noticeably after the first 2 dances, at which point she told him so, and he said, with the dry precision she had come to love, that he was a quick study when the subject matter was sufficiently motivating. Clara cried during the toasts, which Clara denied afterward and Florence never contradicted. They moved into Roy's house on the north edge of town, which was a solid house that he had built with more care than ostentation, 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen and a porch that faced west and caught the sunset. Florence added her mother's curtains and Thomas's books and 2 of her own additions, a braided rug in the sitting room that she made herself over the course of 3 weeks because she found the work calming, and a window box on the porch in which she grew herbs because having growing things nearby was something she had decided was not optional. Roy Ford was, she discovered in the intimacy of marriage, a different kind of person in private than in public, which she had suspected and which was confirmed in ways that were consistently better than she had expected. He was quieter, in a comfortable way rather than a withheld way. He was funnier than he let anyone outside their home see, with a dry and observational humor that came out mostly in the evenings, often at his own expense in a way that was self-aware rather than self-deprecating. He was, it turned out, an excellent cook of a small repertoire of dishes, which he produced with complete focus, and which he received compliments on with transparent pleasure. He was also, she found, a man who had spent so long braced for loss that the simple continuity of being with someone who was not going anywhere required some adjustment, and she watched him make that adjustment over the weeks after their marriage with a patience and affection that she hoped communicated what she meant it to communicate, which was that she was here, fully and without reservation, and planned to remain so. She made this explicit one evening in November, sitting on the porch in the early cold with a blanket over both their laps and the stars doing their winter thing, which in Texas was more elaborate than anywhere she had previously lived. "I am not leaving," she said. "I know you know that. I also know that knowing something and trusting it are not the same thing, so I am saying it directly." He turned to look at her. In the dark his face was all shadow and the pale light of stars, and his expression was the most unguarded she had yet seen it. "I know," he said. "Good," she said. "Florence," he said. "Yes." "I love you," he said, with the same care he brought to everything that mattered, precise and whole. "I did not know after everything that I was still capable of it. Of this kind of love. It appears that I was wrong." She took his hand under the blanket, which was her answer, and also said, "I love you too, Roy Ford, dark past and secrets and all." "Mostly resolved secrets," he said. "Mostly," she agreed. "The bird names were an unexpected bonus." "The bird names are a lifelong asset," he said with dignity. She laughed, and the laugh went out into the cold Texas night and dissolved into all the other good things she was slowly learning to trust. In December, Florence discovered she was expecting a child. She told Roy on a Sunday morning before church, sitting at the kitchen table with the early light coming through her mother's curtains and the smell of the coffee he had made filling the house. She told him simply, watching his face as she did, the sequence of responses that moved through it, starting with something that looked like disbelief, and moving rapidly through several other states to something that she could only describe as a man arriving somewhere he had not known, he was traveling toward and finding it more beautiful than he had imagined. He stood up from the table, took her face in both his hands with a gentleness that was completely at odds with the size and steadiness of them, and said nothing for a long moment. "A child," he said at last. "A child," she confirmed. "Our child," he said, as though the possessive was the most remarkable thing in the world, which perhaps it was. "That is the traditional arrangement," she said, and then added more softly because she could see what this meant to him. "Yes, ours." He kissed her forehead, stayed there for a moment with his lips against her hair. When he stepped back, his eyes were bright in a way she would tell Clara about later, and Clara would say, "I knew," and Florence would say, "I know you knew," and they would both be pleased. The town responded to the news with the collective warmth of a community that has adopted two people and found in their happiness a reflection of something good about themselves. Clara organized, without being asked, a practical campaign of food and supplies in the manner of a quartermaster preparing for a specific campaign. Reverend Packard said a prayer, several of them, at various intervals over the following months. The older children at the school regarded the development with thoughtful interest, and the younger ones with complete incomprehension that resolved itself, in Florence's continued excellent health and competence, into approximate indifference. She taught school through the winter and into the spring with the particular determination of a woman who finds her work meaningful, and has no patience for the suggestion that meaningful work should stop simply because her body was doing something remarkable. She modified what needed modifying and continued what could be continued. And Mayor Holt, who raised the subject once and received a look from Florence that he later described to his wife as educational, did not raise it again. Roy walked her to school every morning from February onward, which was not strictly necessary, and which Florence permitted, because she understood that it was not about her safety, but about his need to be near her. And because she found that she wanted him near too, which was its own kind of revelation, that someone else's nearness could feel like an addition rather than a subtraction. The baby was born in July, 1 year after Caleb Merritt had ridden into redemption, and 1 year and 2 months after Florence Quinn had stepped off a stagecoach into a town whose name was a promise she had not expected anyone to keep. He was a boy, which Roy Ford greeted with a stunned joy that Florence found deeply touching, and which Clara greeted with the satisfaction of someone who has been quietly hoping for a particular outcome and received it. They named him Thomas Roy Ford, which caused Roy to go very still and then look at her with an expression that she felt in her chest for days afterward. Thomas was born in July in the summer heat of Texas, into a house with braided rugs and herb boxes and west-facing sunsets, and two people who had each been carrying their losses for long enough that the weight had become familiar, and who found in each other and now in this small specific person a reason to set some of the weight down. He was a healthy baby who cried with impressive conviction, and who had his father's dark eyes and his mother's quality of absolute attention to whatever was in his immediate environment, which Roy Ford noted with the wondering pride of a new parent, and Florence noted with the rueful recognition of someone who understands exactly what that quality entails. The first time Roy sat in the chair by the window with Thomas in his arms, in the quiet of an evening after Florence had dozed off from sheer exhaustion, she woke to see them. This man who had spent years barely surviving his own history, looking at his son with an expression of such completely unguarded tenderness that she lay still and did not move, preserving it, storing it like something she would take out and examine in every future year of her life. He looked up and caught her watching, and instead of the usual armor going up, he just looked at her. She looked back. The evening light moved through her mother's curtains. Thomas made a small sound of complete contentment in his sleep, the sound of a person who does not yet know that the world is complicated and is simply present in the warmth of being held. "I thought about leaving," Roy said quietly. "When Merritt sent that message, for years before that even, I was never quite sure whether staying in one place was something I was permitted to do, whether it would be taken from me. And now," she said. He looked at the child in his arms, looked at her. And what was in his face was not the thing behind glass, not the careful managed surface she had first met on the steps of the church, but something whole and present and real. "Now I know this is where I am supposed to be," he said. "This is the place. I was just waiting all those years for it to be fully true." Florence got up from the bed, moving carefully because she was still tired and still sore and completely disinclined to be careful about either, and came to him and sat on the arm of the chair, and he shifted Thomas to one arm with an ease that was already becoming natural, and put the other arm around her, and they sat in the window of their house in Redemption, Texas, on a July evening that smelled of cedar and dry grass and the particular warmth that lives inside rooms where people are loved. The town moved around them outside, doing what towns do in the evening, its noises familiar and comfortable. Clara was probably still in the store. Pete was probably making his rounds. The Silver Nail had its lamp lit. The church stood white and freshly painted against the dimming sky. The school was dark, waiting for September, waiting for Florence to come back and open its windows again and fill it with the sound of children being asked to pay attention to the world. In 2 years, there would be another child, a girl this time, born in the spring and named Margaret after Roy's mother, who he had not spoken of before and spoke of now with the uncovered ease of a man who has finally decided his past belongs to him rather than the other way around. Margaret would have Florence's gray eyes and Roy's stubborn disposition, and Thomas's early tendency toward loud and specific opinions, and she would terrorize the schoolchildren and her father's deputy in equal measure, and grow up in a town that she understood, in the deep bone-level way of children who are raised somewhere with real roots, was hers in some essential way. In 5 years, The school would have 2 rooms and 18 students and a second teacher, a young man from Austin named Brennan who Florence would mentor with the same combination of high standards and genuine care that her students had taught her was the only form of teaching worth doing. Roy Ford would remain sheriff of Redemption for another decade. And then, when he finally handed the star to Pete, who had grown from a nervous boy into a steady and capable man, he would do it in the certainty that the town was protected and that the chapter it was moving into was a good one. He would spend his later years on the north edge of town, in the house with the west-facing porch, raising horses with a quiet expertise that surprised people who had known him only as a lawman, and reading, and arguing about George Eliot with Florence, and sitting in the evenings with the accumulated warmth of a life that had been pulled back from the edge of its own darkness and turned toward something better. The name Caleb Merritt was eventually tried in federal court on multiple charges and sentenced to 20 years, which was more than 3 and considerably closer to what Roy Ford had expected the first time. He heard the news in a letter from Marshall Crane, read it at the kitchen table and put it down and said nothing for a moment. Florence watched him. "Is it done?" she asked. "It is done," he said. He folded the letter and put it in the drawer where he kept the important papers, the federal document with his real name and his protected status, and all the legitimacy that had been assembled around who he actually was, the birth records for Thomas and Margaret, the deed to the house, the marriage certificate with both their names on it in the careful cursive of the Reverend Packard, who had retired the previous year to Santa Fe, and whose replacement was a younger man with progressive ideas about music in the service. He closed the drawer. Florence poured coffee and put a cup in front of him and sat down across the table in the chair she always occupied, the one with the particular angle that caught the morning light from the east window, and he picked up his coffee, and she picked up hers, and they sat together in the kitchen of their house in the town of Redemption, in the year 1887. In the life they had made from darkness and determination, and the extraordinary, unlikely good fortune of 2 people with hidden burdens finding each other in a town full of heat and dust, and the stubborn human aspiration contained in its name. Thomas ran in from the yard, 6 years old and covered in dirt, and enormously pleased about something he had found in the vegetable garden that turned out to be an interesting beetle, which he presented to his father with the solemnity of a scientist delivering important findings. Roy Ford examined the beetle with complete seriousness, named its species without hesitation, and explained to his son 3 remarkable facts about its biology that Thomas received with eyes like dinner plates and immediately went to tell Margaret, who was 3 and not yet capable of appreciating beetles but would be. Florence watched Roy Ford watch his son run back out into the yard and saw on his face the thing she had been watching for and finding, for years now, in the unguarded moments, the full and present joy of a man who had come home to himself. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the way he had put his hand over hers in the schoolroom when everything was uncertain and the truth was just beginning to come out into the light. He turned his hand over and held hers. Outside, Thomas was explaining beetles to Margaret with impressive authority, and Dusk the horse was in the paddock doing whatever horses do in July mornings, and the town of Redemption was going about its business in the morning heat with the comfortable industry of a place that has found its footing. And inside the house, at the kitchen table, in the ordinary extraordinary morning of a life that had been put together from pieces that were not supposed to fit, and had decided to fit anyway, Roy Ford and Florence Quinn held hands across the table and did not need to say anything at all. Some things, when they are fully true, do not need words. They had used enough of them. They had spoken the hard ones and the soft ones and the ones that cost something and the ones that gave something back. They had spoken names that had not been spoken in years and found that the speaking, though it tore at old wounds, also let them breathe. They had found in a town named for the second chance exactly that. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in every way that mattered, everything.